And it is time for another edition of Clare History in Focus, and joining us as ever is the local historian and author Colm Liddy. Colm, good morning to you.
Good morning, Alan.
Because we are in Ennistymon, you're going to take us through a brief little run through our history of Ennistymon.
That's right. So, if we start at the very beginning, the oldest thing in Ennistymon right now is its graveyard, because of course it's on a site that was once a churchyard. The exact year isn't known, but it's at least 1,000 years old, if not 1,500, somewhere in those kind of region. The second oldest are the three castles. I'm talking about specifically, you take out west, there's one in Lahinch, which is now part of the castle golf course. So that's one. And there's one as you enter Ennistymon, you'd kind of notice the ruins of it up on a hill as you enter Ennistymon from the east. So what you're left with then is that the third one was the middle of three. And so you get the phrase Inish Island T Man, the middle house. The middle house, island of the middle house. Inish T Man becomes Ennistymon. So that's where that comes from. And ultimately that castle, the middle one, was essentially where the Falls Hotel is now. It was rebuilt numerous times, but basically that's the Falls Hotel, the centre of it since beginning.
So that's the oldest site in Ennistymon, but I sense there's a lot of history to Ennistymon regardless.
So, the central thing, of course, in it that it has is a spectacular cascade over the Cullen River at that site. And obviously cascades, beautiful to look at, but for practical reasons, they were also where people went across rivers in ancient times when there was no bridges. There was hardly any bridges in Clare. There was a period when the only bridge in Clare was in Quinn, literally.
That was it?
That was it. Everywhere else you got your feet wet. But eventually a man came called Edward O'Brien, one of the well-known O'Brien clan, and in 1777 he built the bridge across the town. So Ennistymon could be said to have really arrived into its existence at that stage. And over the years then he started adding things to it. It had a market and a fair, and it was, essentially serving the hinterland. It was all around there. Incidentally, the rise of Ennistymon, if you like, led to the eclipse of Kilfenora, which up to that point had been the main town in North Clare. And by they get all the other stuff, the police barracks, the courthouse, market house, hospitals, churches, all of that, by and by over the 1700s and 1800s. Now, one fella who kind of is the first sort of major historical character from there is Brian Merriman. And he was if you like, the last of the great Irish poets who wrote in the Irish language. And born and raised in Ennistymon, ultimately wound up spending much of his life in the Feakle area, and I suppose is often associated with there. But there's a statue to him in Ennistymon, and ultimately he wrote this epic poem of over 1,000 lines called The Midnight Court. It's just bizarrely modern in its way. It's essentially about the gender war between men and women in Irish with jokes.
Okay, it's got everything going for it, all right.
As regards major historical events, well, in Ireland, everybody is familiar with the concept of the 1798 rebellion. It was meant to be a national rebellion, but in effect, it really only took place seriously in one place, Wexford. So far, so good. But there were aftershocks of the rebellion, because actually the people of Clare had been ready and willing, but there was some major purges by the military who picked up all the weapons throughout East Clare. And so it wound up that 6 months later, there was a little aftershock, the 1799 rebellion, which happened really in one place, in Ennistymon. So there was large gatherings of the peasantry with what weapons they had, mostly pikes and sticks and stones. Sadly, they were, of course, no match for the military who marched out to meet them. Ultimately, the two ringleaders in Clare were Hugh Kildare, a hedge schoolmaster, and Michael Murphy, a farmer. They were hung from a gallows in the centre of Ennistymon, with a huge kind of show trial and then execution to put people off having any dangerous thoughts from then on.
Right, let that be a lesson to the rest of you. And that quells that particular mini rebellion.
Indeed. The next big event, I suppose, in Ennistymon is that the British decide to carve up the county of Clare into 4 large unions, and later they would subdivide it even further. But bizarrely enough, this was the moment in history, it's around, I think it's 1839, that the beginnings of what one might call social welfare. And of course, what social welfare means in its earliest state is workhouses. Up to that moment in history, the widows, orphans, disabled, elderly, there was no state provision for them. They were minded to the extent that they were at all by the kindness of strangers and the kindness of the community. Private charity, you might call it. That's what was keeping people alive. And at this moment, the state begins to take more of an intervention into the thing.
Why at this point did the state decide to take an intervention into the situation when previously, as long as we've known, as you say, it was left to the kindness of strangers, or was basically fend for yourself?
Well, it had arisen, first of all, a few decades earlier in England. They already had that system, the workhouse. And tragically, just before they set up the Irish system, they did a review of the situation in Ireland, or in England. And what they found was that, quite frankly, it was way too generous. As they saw it.
We never get a break in Ireland. They couldn't find this out after 20 years of it being here in Ireland.
So instead, they then go to Ireland and think, right, well, you know those Irish, what they're like. We better make damn sure now that there'll be no way that they're going to take us for a ride. Because I suppose another thing is, taxation is really, really low up in history up to now. You know, now we're used to a situation where, God help us, if you earn any money at all, it's taxed to an extreme extent here in Ireland. And, you know, like the frog in the boiling water, we've gotten used to it and accept this. Well, by God, they most certainly didn't accept it. At this moment in history, income tax does not yet exist. No, indeed.
What you earn, all of what you earn is your own.
It is. You pay now, there is taxes, but it's on consumption.
Okay.
What one might call like VAT, you know, it's on various transactions and consumption of items. That's how you pay tax. But by and large, you know, there is no income tax. And it's only slowly that sort of thing. So they're resentful of any tax. And obviously the poor looking after them will have to be paid for by somebody. So it is decided to have a new kind of local tax called the Poor Law Tax, which will be a tax on people who occupy land, essentially farmers, you know, and indeed landlords. But if you own any land or even occupied as a tenant, you're going to have to pay a few pence, you know, per acre. So that's how it's done. But no one wants to pay it, so it's kept to the bare minimum. And hence, the workhouse system is made extremely draconian. It's sort of, unless you're really, really desperate, you won't be going in here, you know, for the handy bed and meals, you know, which would be provided, admittedly. One of its worst features is that people are separated, families. There's a men's wing, a women's wing, and children. And only children under 2 are allowed to stay with their mothers. Even from 2 upwards, they have to go into a separate wing, you know. So it was deeply unpalatable.
You really have to be, I suppose, I don't know, close to death or faced with zero options to want to go into one of these places. To all intents and purposes, it's basically a prison.
Yeah.
That you can leave.
Well, funnily enough, circumstances are about to bring that to pass. Because yes, for the first few years, the workhouse stood there largely empty. And there was 4 of them in Clare. The others were Kilrush, Ennis and Scariff. But anyway, the Ennistymon more or less empty, very few people. And then, of course, the famine. And after a few years of the famine, people absolutely did want to get in. And it had been built for 600 people. But by the end of it, there was at least 2,000 in it at any given time. And sadly, of course, a huge amount of them died. In Clare, the actual records of who was in the workhouses, unfortunately, they have not survived. But a few little fragments have. And one of them is, and it's quite... well, it's interesting, but it's also wretchedly sad. And what it is the people who died in Ennistymon from March 1850 to March 1851. So a 1-year period. But you might say a 1-year period where the famine is largely over, you know, or certainly the worst of it is over. Yeah. So what do we find when we look at it? And all this, you can check this out on the Clare Library website, which is, of course, a huge source of history, has all this information. And sadly, what you see is that a huge amount of the dead that year are children. If I counted them, 420, just in that year. That's when, if you like, you can only extrapolate backwards what it must have been like in 1847, you know, plainly double, treble, you know, you name it.
God, even
no one will ever know is the truth.
Unthinkable.
Yeah. So, you know, you go on and just see their names, the ordinary Irish names, and you see B.D. Considine, age 6. Diarrhea. Tommy Crow, age 2, smallpox. Michael Daly, age 4, starvation. And there it is, you know, just, it's a wretched aspect of the famine that I think we can easily overlook, which is that the population was so young, so incredibly young. Like, and we were, in Clare, had one of the youngest, incredibly, 47% of the Irish, or the Clare population, were children. When you consider that in Clare, 40% of the population, like right now, the number of children we have in the county is more like 20 to 20%-ish are children. Back then it was 47%. Back then the average age of a Clare person was 22. Now it's 42. You know, we are way older than we were then, a lot older. You know, it's just to say it's an interesting insight about the famine. It happened to children much more than we normally think about it.
Okay, more difficult for them to fend for themselves, I guess. Anything else that to remark about Ennistymon?
Well, that building no longer exists, although there is a little memorial statue close by to that area on the road out to Lahinch. Another thing that you'll find out there high up on a hill is the old convent. For many years it was both a primary and secondary school, a huge part of Ennistymon history. That was built in 1875. And I suppose what it takes us back to a time is the 1800s began with no nuns in Clare. There were no official nuns. But by the end of it, we had a vast amount of them. In every corner and part of Clare, there were nuns. A huge amount of manpower or woman power meant that they took over hospital and schools en masse throughout Clare. Now, eventually, it all sort of petered out, obviously, and I think that school began to close in the 1990s. It's been abandoned now for a good while, but I note that a developer is doing something with it, and it seems there will be some sort of residential units high up out there on the hill quite soon. Another thing that used to exist in the town was, of course, the West Clare Railway ran through it. That came to an end in 1961 with the last train arriving in Ennistymon and then departing again for Ennis. One thing that still exists, the station has been turned into a B&B, but the bridge across the river, the controversial river, which obviously causes major bottlenecks, but there is actually and has been left there. The railway bridge has existed ever since and is just unused. I don't know why, really. Fast forwarding a lot in time, we get to, of course, the War of Independence. Again, Ennistymon was where a large amount of black and tans were stationed. To that end, as the war really intensified, the local units of the IRA began to learn their movements, and eventually they ambushed them on a village road just outside and killed 6 of the black and tans. And in reprisal, the boys came in and burned half the houses of Ennistymon at that down to the ground, and 2 civilians were shot dead.
Half the houses? I mean, roughly speaking, are we talking dozens?
Dozens, yeah.
Okay. Anything else to note after that?
Okay, well, now we'll have a little upturns of the mood of the whole thing. In the 19th century, Ennistymon gradually became a great place for shopping. A lot of thriving shops and indeed behind-the-scenes industry, really, because you had quite a few of them were making leather and shoes, boots. There was a specialty of them indeed making women's stockings, both in silk and in wool behind the scenes. And indeed, in 1964, it was still kind of the tail end of it, 2 of the Beatles, John Lennon and George Harrison, passed through the town on their way to go and see the Cliffs of Moher. And it is alleged that they went to one of the shops called Walls that did leather and shoes, and that John Lennon bought a handmade pair of leather boots.
Well, that is, I hope they still have his picture behind the counter.
As well, Ennistymon is notable that as most towns in Ireland go, far more of the shop fronts from that era have still survived. So it is a very pretty town, really, down on its main street. But now let me get to what is my favourite Ennistymon person. He exists in a time, you could say, before Ennistymon itself. And he lived out in the countryside, just outside the town, in a townland called Muhanna. Muhanna is still known now, actually. It's a place where they make fresh milk, that is...
Yeah, people would be familiar with the company.
The company, yeah. Yes. Well, that's the place anyway. And it existed, and we go back now to 1699, way back. There was a man, fairly wealthy sort of fella called Patrick Hurley, and he lived high on the hill there in Muhanna. And one night, he was a fella, we'll say he'd have had servants and a big family in the house. Suddenly, they were attacked by robbers. Came in, shot up the place a bit, and tied up all the men, gave them a bit of a beating and put them in a room, and the women were also locked away. And then they stole all the money and all the jewellery and, valuables. Now, what was around that time, the state would actually compensate you because Ireland was constantly in a state of war. They would compensate you if a lot was taken. So our Patrick Hurley put in a claim for £1,500. Quite a lot. Now, as the authorities began to investigate it, they started to think that this was all a hoax. That in fact, Patrick Hurley had paid these men to pretend to rob money that he didn't even have. So Patrick was jailed, but he was a sweet talker and he managed to get out mostly by kind of accusing a lot of other people of things, and eventually he was let go. But he went off into Europe and he began to put together an amazing career as essentially a con man and a carriage cheat and a master of disguise. Amongst other things, he also had a great command of all the European languages at that time. Well, certainly French, Spanish, Portuguese, and
the major languages.
The main ones. He knew them all. And because he'd been quite well educated. So off he goes anyway to London. And he does an elaborate sting where there's a fellow, a nouveau riche sort of guy who had a lot of money but didn't have an aristocratic pedigree to get on in society. Well, our Patrick told him that he could get that for him. So there was a elaborate sting, but ultimately your man had to meet a certain lady sitting on a certain bench in Hyde Park, and she would hand him a little package. And he was not to open the package until he got back. And naturally, he was to hand her a large ball of money. He did this. And when he got home to his house and opened the package that he thought was this pedigree, he opened it up and all it was parchment with the lyrics of a song. And when he went to find Patrick Hurley and the woman, they of course had fled town with all the money. So off our man goes out into Europe. He became noticeable in Italy, where he was playing billiards up and down the major cities. He presented himself, you see, as the Earl of Donegal. And he had the airs and graces, and he would put money into it, like he'd have the carriage, the footmen. He'd arrive in town and speaking, very eloquently. And he had the airs. So they took him at his word. So he won at billiards up in both Venice and Naples, thousands of pounds. Then he went to Amsterdam, where again he took them into his confidence. And an Amsterdam banker, he was the centre of banking at that time, gave him £10,000. Or Patrick absconded with it. And you may be wondering, how does he get all this money and what does he do with it? And he basically spends it on the good life, He just gets all the good stuff that he wants, and has a high living. And of course, his one weakness, women.
Being the weakness of so many.
To whom he gives, again, whatever money he gets. But his final big sting was he goes to French society. And again, now he's got a new name and a slightly different disguise. But he starts hanging around with various hobnobs, viscounts and marquises and what have you. And eventually he does such a good job with kind of ingratiating himself with them that he is introduced to the Sun King himself, Louis XIV, in Versailles. And our man from Muhana in Ennistymon finds himself at a carriage table across from the Sun King. Need I say that he wins £14,000 off the Sun King. And after that, Patrick decides that it might be as well to leave France, which he does the very next night. And what became him after that is unknown. He kind of fades from history then. And I mean, there's two you can take, which he either was murdered by some person angry at all the money he'd stolen from them, or possibly he just simply changed into another alias, another disguise, and settled down to the good life somewhere with no further drama.
I don't know, given his previous habits and spending habits, something suggests he wasn't living the lap of luxury for too long with the way money was being frittered. What a guy. This has to be a movie made about that individual.
Yeah, it was the kind of life you could only live in the 1700s. It was, if you had the cojones to do that, you could.
Different times, folks, different times. Fascinating information there on various people and places in Ennistymon. Colm Liddy, thank you so much for filling us in on that. And we look forward to speaking to you again when I think we'll be returning to the William Smith O'Brien story.
That's right.
Okay,
right, yeah.
So we'll check in again. You don't have a shop front like the shops in Ennistymon because it's online. Where can people find you?
That's right. Shopinireland.ie.
Brilliant stuff. Colm Liddy, until next time, thank you very much.